Warning: contains somewhat mature content, including language, brief violence, and mild sexual themes, and may not be suitable for people under age 14.
Reitan dashed out of the room and down the staircase. Cho could hear Persephone crashing into the walls very close behind them. Reitan ran down a hallway and opened a door, flitting inside it and slamming the door shut. Cho looked around and saw they were in a broom closet. "Reitan, what?" she began, but Reitan silenced her.
"Baron taught me how to clone," he said quickly. "Keep still."
He set his hand on Cho's head, and a second Cho appeared next to her. Reitan pulled the real Cho over to a cardboard box and set her inside it.
"Stay in there and don't make a sound," he demanded, and covered the box with a blanket.
He put his arms around the fake Cho and stared at the closet door until Persephone broke it down. "Aha!" she exclaimed in delight. She grabbed the clone from Reitan, and the clone screamed in fright. Reitan stood. "No! Please don't take her!" he shouted, but Persephone laughed evilly and opened a portal, disappearing. Reitan stood there for a minute or two, then rushed over to help the real Cho out of the box. Cho smiled at him as she climbed out. "That was genius, Reitan," she said. Reitan gave a weak smirk.
"Yeah, well, it won't be long before they figure out it wasn't you Persephone took," he replied. "I give them 3 days before they come back for you. When they try to execute the clone, it'll just disintegrate, and they'll know it was fake."
Cho nodded, and she followed Reitan back up to the room. Cho crawled onto the bed, then looked over at Reitan, who had sighed angrily. He had his hands on his hips as he stared at his ruined door and dead guards.
"That bitch killed my guards and broke my door," he said in a low voice. "If I get a chance, I'll kill her."
He looked at Cho.
"You can go back to sleep. I'm going to stay up to fix my door."
Cho nodded and slid under the covers, falling asleep quickly once more. When Cho woke up the next morning, she heard 2 voices speaking to each other very softly. She listened hard before distinguishing them as Reitan and Baron.
"The invasion is about a week away,"
Reitan was saying in a dull whisper.
"I was planning on attacking then, but things have changed after last night."
"You think it'll be long before they come back for Cho?"
Baron asked. 3 days at the most," Reitan replied. "Could be sooner. Cho is supposed to be executed, but as soon as Drakus finds out I gave them a fake Cho, I'll be executed as well. We have no choice but to prepare for battle by tomorrow."
Baron gasped, and Reitan let out a soft shh.
"Are you crazy?"
Baron whispered urgently.
"Your soldiers aren't even strong enough yet. There's no way they'd survive fighting against Drakus."
There was a brief moment of silence.
"Then we have no choice but to change the attack plan," said Reitan slowly. "Instead of half my soldiers fighting alongside you to take out Drakus' guards, and half coming with me to take out Drakus himself, I'm afraid that you'll have to take all of my soldiers with you."
"Then who's going to help you and Cho kill Drakus?"
Baron asked.
"Cho and I will go about it alone," said Reitan. "If it looks like my soldiers are having an easy time defeating the guards, then you are welcome to join us."
"You're crazy,"
said Baron, but said no more than that. Cho waited a few minutes before sitting up and rubbing her eyes. Reitan looked over at her, and Cho saw that Baron was no longer there. She assumed he had left.
"Good morning," said Reitan. "I hope I didn't wake you."
Cho smiled. "Not at all," she lied. "Internal alarm clock." Reitan chuckled.
"Right," he said. "Let's go downstairs to eat something."
Cho nodded and hopped off the bed, following Reitan down to the kitchen. On the way there, she noticed huge cracks in the walls where Persephone had hit on the way to catch her prey the night before. Once in the kitchen, Reitan made some hot cereal for them, then sat down next to Cho, and they began eating in silence. Cho could tell that Reitan was worried. She looked over at him to see him glaring at his food as he ate, and she knew he was lost in thought. Just then, Nestle scuttled into the kitchen, looking worried.
"Master,"
she squeaked.
"it's raining."
Reitan blinked, then gasped.
"No,"
he said, and stood up, hurrying to the front door of his mansion. Cho furrowed her brow and followed, not understanding what was so bad about rain. Reitan opened the door, and the 3 of them stepped outside. Cho gasped, staring at the sky. It was a deep crimson with swirling black clouds scattered in places. It looked just like the sky in the cemetery that Cho had fallen into the other night. Aside from the sky, there were also large crimson droplets falling from above. Cho extended her hand in front of her to catch some of these droplets. She examined them, then let out a shriek and shook the liquid off her hand. It was raining blood.
Reitan, she said, voice shaking. What's going on?
Reitan stared at the sky, lips parted.
The only time it ever rains in the underworld, he began slowly, is when something terrible is about to happen.
Cho blinked and he grabbed hers and Nestle's hands, pulling them inside and shutting the door.
We can't wait any longer, he told them. The time for war is now. If we don't go now, then...
Suddenly, a dark pink portal opened in the middle of the room, and out stepped a very beautiful female demon.
Oh yes, we are in trouble now, aren't we, my dear Reitan?
She said in a melodious voice. She looked almost human. She was about the same height as Cho, and she had bubblegum pink-colored hair. Her eyes were hot pink cat eyes and her skin a soft ivory. She had dark shadows beneath her eyes, making her look beautiful, but menacing at the same time. She was wearing a very tight black and pink vinyl outfit, which resembled a bathing suit with a corset and knee-high black stiletto boots. Reitan's eyes narrowed at this demon.
Cheska,
he growled. Cheska giggled, her black painted lips curling into a smile.
Oh, you remember me,
she sang.
How exciting.
Hard to forget the girl who was madly in love with me during our time at the training academy,
Reitan growled through gritted teeth. Cho blinked, looking from Cheska to Reitan, then back at Cheska, who giggled again.
What are you doing here?
Reitan continued.
His Majesty's personal right-hand demon was ordered to be executed due to failure of retrieval of the human female,
Cheska replied, having a new air of importance.
Persephone is dead. I am the new right-hand demon to serve Emperor Drakus.
She giggled and danced over to Reitan.
My first order of business is to kill both you and your little girlfriend.
Cho gasped as Reitan pulled her out of harm's way, as Cheska had thrown a ball of pink fire where they had been standing. Nestle, being so small, hadn't been seen by Cheska yet.
If you think I'm going to let you kill us,
said Reitan,
you got another thing coming.
Cheska laughed beautifully and threw more fire at them, which Reitan dodged.
There's a reason why I was chosen to serve directly under Drakus, Reitan,
she sang, her eyes following Reitan's every move.
I have a few tricks up my sleeve.
Reitan scoffed.
I was in all of your classes, he said, sounding amused. I know all of your tricks.
Cheska pouted slightly for a moment.
Oh, do you really? I guess I can't defeat you then.
She suddenly smiled and thrust her hand forward, and a strange pink substance shot from her palm. Reitan gasped and shoved Cho out of the way, and was hit by the substance. He was forced against the wall, and the pink stuff was stretched over his body like a giant wad of gum. Reitan struggled, but couldn't break free.
What is this stuff?
He shouted, panicked. Cheska laughed.
Just a little thing I decided to work on in my spare time, she replied. After graduation, I began working on this new technique. That pink stuff is a very sticky putty and is indestructible.
As Cheska laughed again, Reitan began trying different means of breaking the pink goo, but nothing worked. Cho growled and rushed forward to attack Cheska, but was hit with the goo as well, sticking to the wall opposite of Reitan.
Cho!
Reitan shouted, now trying even harder to escape. Cho also tried to escape, but she got the same results as Reitan did. Nothing.
Oh dear,
said Cheska.
I'm in a quandary. I can't decide who to kill first.
Cho stopped struggling, watching Cheska with wide eyes. Cheska smiled at her, then walked over to Reitan.
I know, she said. I'll kill you first. That way, I'll get the pleasure of hearing your girlfriend cry and plead for me to spare you.
No! Cho screamed. Don't touch him! Cheska giggled.
Yes, girl, keep that up.
Cheska held up a ball of pink fire. She was about to shove it in Reitan's face, but she was suddenly knocked down onto the floor. Cheska screamed, looking around wildly to see what hit her. Nestle walked over to her, smirking at the bewildered expression on her face.
I have a few tricks up my sleeve as well,
said Nestle. Cheska laughed.
You had a lucky shot,
she shrieked shrilly.
You're so tiny, what could you possibly do to hurt me?
Cheska stood up, seeming to tower over Nestle. Nestle smirked again, and her little body glowed bright green. She slowly began to grow and morph, filling up the room with sudden huge body mass. Cheska watched, eyes wide, lip trembling. Finally, Nestle stopped changing. She now looked exactly like Drakus, and was even the same size. Cheska whimpered and tried to run away, but Nestle grabbed her with a huge clawed hand. Cheska screamed like a banshee, but was silenced as Nestle's hand tightened around her and crushed her to death. Blood dripped onto the floor, and Nestle slowly shrunk down back to her original form. The pink putty that held Raiden and Cho suddenly disappeared. "What happened to the pink stuff?" Cho asked. Raiden wiped off his pants.
"Because its owner died, it died as well,"
he replied. He turned to Nestle and smiled.
"Your shape-shifting came in handy after all. I would love it if you helped my soldiers destroy Drakus' guards. Will you?"
Nestle smiled and nodded. "Are we going to go now?" Cho asked, voice shaking slightly. Raiden looked at her and nodded. He turned back to Nestle.
"I'm giving you a very important job," he said to her. "You are to go straight to Baron and tell him it's time to attack. He has my soldiers with him already."
Nestle saluted to Raiden and stepped through her own little green portal. Raiden opened a portal as well and pulled Cho through it. When they stepped out to the other side, Cho saw a huge castle. She expected it to be Drakus' castle, but from only seeing the inside once, she never expected it to be so big. Raiden took her hand and ran with her over to a wall of the castle where there were no guards.
"We can't go inside until Baron and them get a head start," he explained in a whisper to Cho. "He needs to clear out the guards so we can get the Drakus."
Cho nodded, looking around the wall, seeing many guards placed at the entrance of the castle. After a few minutes, a portal opened in front of the castle doors, and Baron rushed out of it, followed by Nestle, and then all of Raiden's army. The guards took a stance, ready to attack, but Baron plowed through them as if they were paper. The army rushed into the castle, and Raiden ran after them, Cho following close behind. As they ran through the castle, taking stairs up to the top, they passed many corpses of demons that Raiden's army had defeated. Every now and then, Cho recognized a corpse as one of Raiden's soldiers, but there were only few. Finally, Raiden and Cho came to the top floor, seeing the huge doors to Drakus' room. Baron and the rest of the army were busy fighting off many guards. Raiden hurried into the room before the guards could notice him and Cho.
"Well, well,"
said Drakus as the door slammed shut behind Raiden and Cho.
"I should have known you'd be up to no good, Raiden. I'm afraid this is the end for you and your little friend."
"No, Drakus," said Raiden, sounding very confident. "I'm afraid that it'll be you who falls tonight." Drakus laughed and shot lightning at Raiden, who dodged. Cho was frozen, watching Drakus and Raiden battle furiously. She was so stunned by the action she had forgotten that she was no longer a mere human. She closed her eyes and began to shift. The white marble room had turned to black, and Drakus had stopped attacking Raiden. He looked around, seemingly frightened.
"What the?"
He looked down to Cho just in time to see the glowing white shards of glass swirling around her head. Cho glared up at him and sent the shards flying towards Drakus. He screamed in pain as the shards took chunks out of his huge body, but there just wasn't enough of the glass to tear him apart. Baron came into the room, looking at the battle progressing before his eyes. Raiden was standing at the side, throwing every possible attack at Drakus to help Cho, but even both of their strongest attacks combined weren't doing the trick. Baron furrowed his brow and shifted as well, his blue scales glowing a blinding white. Cho noticed the new glow and looked over at Baron, blinking. He smiled at her.
"Need some help?"
he asked, voice echoing slightly. Cho and Raiden smiled and continued to attack Drakus as much as they could. Drakus screamed in anger, flailing his arms around to try and squish his attackers. Baron held his hands in front of him, and a huge white ball engulfed Drakus completely. Cho stopped attacking to watch as Drakus hit the walls of the ball, trying to break free, but Baron closed his fist tightly, and the ball shrunk in a fraction of a second, crushing Drakus and reducing him to nothing. The ball disappeared, leaving nothing but a huge puddle of blood. Baron and Cho shifted back to normal, and Cho ran to Raiden and hugged him. "We did it!" she said happily. Raiden put his arms around her and smiled at Baron.
"I think it's time for us to go out and announce who the new emperor of the underworld is," he said, and Baron nodded. Raiden opened a portal and the three of them stepped through it. They found themselves on an elevated platform, and Cho could see the entire city that made up the underworld. She looked over the edge straight down to see a huge crowd of demons forming, including Raiden's army. She looked at Raiden and Baron. "Where are we? What's going on?" she asked.
Reitan smiled. "We are in the very heart of the underworld," said Reitan. "This is where announcements are made." He walked over to the edge of the platform and cleared his throat. "Citizens of the underworld," he called out to the millions of demons below, "your emperor is dead!" There was a commotion from the crowd, and Cho couldn't tell whether it was excitement or fear. "I crown myself as the new emperor, and for the first time in history," Reitan took Cho's hand gently, "there will be an empress as well!" Baron stepped forward at that moment.
All hail Emperor Reitan and Empress Cho!
He shouted. The demons below all cheered loudly, and Cho blinked, looking to Reitan. "Empress?" she asked him. Reitan smiled and nodded. "My first act as emperor," Reitan continued to the crowd, "will be to continue the invasion of the human world, but there will not be any humans slain. I will decide the fate of each human of that world." Cho smiled, watching him. "My second act will be to build a new training school for younger demons, with Baron as the teacher." Reitan pointed to Baron, who put his hands in the air, receiving a huge applause. "And finally," said Reitan loudly, "I shall say proudly that you are witnesses to this next event." Reitan looked at Cho and knelt down on one knee, looking up into her eyes. Cho blinked. "Cho, I'm sorry I don't have a ring, but I hope you accept my love all the same. Will you marry me?" Cho blushed, blinking a few times and staring at him. You're in love with me?" she asked, trembling. Reitan nodded. "So in love, it's corny," he said. Cho giggled, tears coming to her eyes. She fell into his arms, hugging him. "Yes, I will marry you." The demons below, of course, didn't understand how serious the situation was, for they did not know about love. All the same, they cheered for the newly engaged humans. Baron clapped loudly, at least having some knowledge of human relationships. Cho wept joyfully in Reitan's arms, and the crimson sky slowly cleared, turning back to white. A few years later, the underworld had successfully taken over the human world. As much as the humans were afraid at first, they had now discovered that it was much better than they had expected. Reitan had ensured the humans' freedom, but had his soldiers police the streets, allowing the death of a human if he or she was not obeying Reitan's new laws, which weren't all that strict. Other than the humans who disobeyed the laws, the other humans coexisted in peace with the demons. Some were even accepted into Baron's new school, where they received demon powers and were trained to be in the army. Tomoko was now living in Reitan's mansion, as was Kane. Reitan had invited Kane because he believed his health might get better if Kane was in a warmer place to live. Cho had insisted that Tomoko and her little kitten, Momo, needed to live in the mansion as well, for she could not be without her best friend. Tomoko had met Kane shortly after moving in, and had become very friendly with him after a short while. Kane also shared a liking for Tomoko on account of his near-human emotions. Every night in Reitan's room, he and Cho would lie in bed and hold each other, staying completely silent. After long hours, Cho would tell Reitan how happy she was, and Reitan would say the same. They would end their night with a long kiss and words of love, then finally falling asleep together. Cho and Reitan, it is said, had become the best thing to had ever happened to both worlds in the entire course of history. This has been a spectacular reading of one of my old stories called The Black Warrior. I admit the defeat of Drakus was a little quick, but I guess it just goes to show that, Baron is superior in every way. I hope you enjoyed this, once again, old story reading audiobook of epic proportions. But now, I say to you, Auf Wiedersehen.